Hello and welcome to Ethics and Society. This is Module 10, 10A and B on ethics of care and feminist perspectives on morality. So before we go any further, I just kind of want to give this idea context. And the context that I'm going to define is essentially the history of civilization and the inferior positions that women have been relegated to throughout history up until the very recent past, let's say over the last 100 years, we'll say. So this idea that men and women think differently has been acknowledged, but it's also been used as a way to discriminate against women, especially in the public sphere. And the notion of women only being useful in the private sphere, in the family hearth, in the kitchen, is sort of assuming domestic roles instead of public roles. This has been the way in which that acknowledgement has been used against women. So over the last, let's say, 150 years of concerted effort by women to push back against this idea, certainly the time that we're going to be discussing today is the shift between, let's say, the second to third wave of feminism. And the ideas at the time in the 60s and 70s was that women did not think differently than men. Men and women were essentially the same psychologically, emotionally, in terms of morality and ethics. Other than perhaps physiologically, men and women are clearly different, but in really every other way, women were just as rational as men. And over time, the idea became that, okay, we are different, but we're equal. So therein lies that shift from an acknowledgement that men and women are essentially the same. We think the same, men and women, to, well, we think differently, but equally both are just as valid. And that's kind of where we've been, because up until very recently, women were simply the subjects of this very oppressive system that held them in place for a very, very long time. So today, feminists, and again, the fourth wave, which we'll not talk about because it is an altogether different thing, but the second to third wave shift gears a little bit by saying that feminists today do believe that men and women think differently, but they think equally. They simply think in a different way. So that's not to say that women's way of thinking is inferior. It's simply a different way of thinking. But that is certainly not a reason to justify discrimination against women simply because they think differently. As a matter of fact, with the amount of writing by feminist thinkers, both in philosophy and sociology, it turns out that female ways of thinking have yielded, ideas and perspectives and insights that, for the most part, have been completely ignored by men. Big surprise, right? So the kinds of ideas that are discussed, the perspectives, the context, all of this has changed now by having the introduction of a female, maybe not necessarily feminist, but a female perspective to make us understand just how we develop morally and we develop also ethically. Now, one gentleman that did a fair amount of work in stages of moral development is this guy here, Lawrence Kohlberg. And he came up with this idea of measuring moral development in kids by coming up with this thing called Eisenhowers Dilemma, which I'll read from the textbook in just a moment. And the notion was that this dilemma was going to allow Kohlberg to study the way in which these two kids, Amy and Jake, respond to the crisis, right? Respond to this dilemma and see how each one would be able to kind of work through the problem and come up with a viable solution, right, to correct the issue. So Amy and Jake have this story told to them, and Kohlberg, as a result, looks at the stages of moral development according to age, and he comes up with 6 stages of moral development that we're going to look at in just a moment. And he talks about where the individual conceived of moral rightness in terms of these stages. Now, before we go any further, I'm just going to read the passage here from, this is, of course, the textbook, and Kohlberg's stages of moral development, and this is the dilemma. Consider the following issue, the dilemma devised by educational psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. Heinz's wife is near death. and her only hope is a drug that was discovered by a pharmacist who is now selling it for an outrageously high price. The drug cost $200 to make, and the pharmacist is selling it for $2,000. Heinz can raise only $1,000, but the pharmacist told him that only half wasn't enough. When Heinz proposed to pay the rest later, the pharmacist still refused. Okay, in desperation, Heinz considers stealing the drug. Would that be wrong? So this is essentially Heinz's dilemma. What does he do? And this is, believe it or not, I mean, these are kids who are like 11, 12 years old being asked to discuss this very difficult situation. So that is Heinz's dilemma. Heinz's wife is dying. There's medication or there's treatment there, but it's too expensive. And Heinz is unable to come up with a full amount. And what is he going to do? So this is the idea that's being sort of presented to these kids. So as Kohlberg is looking at the responses that Amy and Jake present to him in terms of how they're going to deal with these issues, Kohlberg is able to develop this 6-stage movement of moral development. And he starts with the first one, which is, of course, little kids, as you can imagine. Excuse me. Where we have little kids that just simply obey authority and avoid punishment. We understand if we do something wrong, we'll be punished. So we learn very quickly to not do that particular thing. Secondly, and these are kids that are a little bit older, is the notion of satisfying one's desire and letting others do the same. In other words, sharing, right? In other words, delaying gratification. Not eating, the entire ice cream sandwich right now or the chocolate bar, leaving a little bit for later. Although I wouldn't do that with an ice cream bar because you want to gobble that thing up. But at least a chocolate bar, or let's say a bag of chips. So you're able to delay desires so you can kind of control your cravings, your desires, and your instincts. That's kind of, let's say, between 5 to 8. The third one is to cultivate one's relationships and perform the duties of one's social role. So this is sort of pre-adolescent to adolescent, because at that particular point in our lives, we are just beginning to struggle with authority figures. Many of us reject them, only to come back later because you have to at one point, otherwise you end up in jail or dead. But the third one, and the reason why I got it highlighted in yellow, is this one, believe it or not, is the one that Kohlberg thinks women get stuck at, right? They can only go up to the third one. And women end up certainly cultivating relationships with others, but they also perform the duties of one's social roles. Okay, built into that is what? Expectations, right? Expectations that women will act a certain way, that they will want to get married, want to have babies, want to raise a family, and so on. So to the duties of one's social roles sounds very restricting, right? Because it doesn't say a whole range of social roles. Those social roles are very small and they're very private versus the public roles of contract signing and engaging, with others for employment and, exchange of goods and services and so on. Kohlberg believes that women get stuck at this third level. And when you look at the rest of them, they become increasingly difficult. Let's say, for example, 4, right? Obey the law and maintain group welfare. That's certainly conceivable of all of us, right? All of us wish to obey the law to a certain degree. We may jaywalk occasionally, but the rest of us, adhere to the law because we know that it is something we need to do. We should follow the law because we wish others to do the same thing. So there's kind of where the social contract fits in. 5, uphold basic rights and values of one society. Now, this is sort of aiming higher. This is aiming to sort of, ideas about society or even nationhood. And when you want to uphold basic rights and values of one society, it sounds like, you're ready to go to war over it. Well, until very recently, women couldn't go to war, right? So those social roles, again, are very, very limiting depending on who you are. So as you can see, each one of them gets perhaps more abstract, but also the options are getting limited more and more for women. So you can see almost by default, women sort of end up stuck here. Not that they can't develop any further, but historically have been stuck at this third level. And then finally, the last one, abide by abstract universal moral principles. Well, unless you're Immanuel Kant, many of us have great difficulty doing that because abstract universal moral principles, that's a pretty heady, series of propositions that we need to carry around in our heads about, one's duty and the universal good. And sure, we can understand it, we can explain it, but it's aiming high for sure. It's certainly aiming high. And especially when we talk about universal moral principles, again, it sounds like this is the kind of stuff that happens in the public, isn't it? Right? Out in the public sphere rather than the private sphere. So what I'm pointing out here is something that Carol Gilligan, who we're going to look at shortly, ends up pointing out as well. So this one here, right, cultivating one's relationships and perform the duties of one's social role, that is the stage that Kohlberg believes young girls get stuck at and really never grow out of. And they carry this on for the rest of their lives, allegedly. So not me saying that, it's him. So we end up with Heinz's dilemma, as I presented to you just a moment ago out of the book. And we have an 11-year-old boy, Jake. And Jake sort of listens to the story. And he's thinking, okay, listen, this woman, Heinz's wife needs to survive. So you got to steal the drugs. Man, that's all you can do. So what Jake is doing is he's looking at the situation that Heinz is in, weighing the sort of costs and benefits of actions, right? Not so much about the people, but the action that is required for a successful conclusion. And the action for him is to steal the drugs. So Jake is very impersonal, right? He uses these very impersonal principles to argue that Heinz should steal the drugs and cure his wife, because that's really sort of the means-end relationship, right? The means by which he will save his wife, that's the end, right, is to steal the drugs. Even if the pharmacist, loses money or, he's got to break a window, Heinz that is, to break into the pharmacy to get the drugs, those things are secondary. So Jake is very impersonal in the way in which he sees how this is going to play out. Now, Amy, also the same age, listens to the same story, but her response is quite different. She's more involved with the people in the story, not so much actions, but the personal relationships that each of these individuals have between Heinz and his wife, between Heinz and the pharmacist. And she ends up arguing that, well, he should not steal the drugs. Heinz should not steal those drugs because that means that the pharmacist will be out, a $2,000 product because someone has stolen it. So for Kohlberg, according to his sort of little 6-stage schema, he believes that Jake has advanced morally further than Amy. And it kind of begs the question, exactly how did he do it? Now, I've kind of given you a clue by the way I've described the way each individual thought about it. So for Kohlberg, Jake has advanced morally beyond Amy. So let's find out why. All right. The issue with Kohlberg's view is that he's looking at goals. He's looking at cost versus benefits. He's looking at means-ends relationships. Very schematic, very linear, really not involved with people. It really could be anyone. But if the notion is to solve the problem by simply stealing the drugs, that's the goal, right? Get those drugs into Heinz's wife as soon as possible. So what behavioral psychologists such as Kohlberg are doing is they're studying goal-oriented behavior rather than thought processes. And the thought processes are the things that Amy, on the other hand, is very concerned with. She is thinking more so about, okay, well, is there not something that the pharmacist can do to arrange, maybe he can give him maybe $1,000 worth of the drugs to even kind of keep her from dying, and then, he'll raise a little bit more money. Let's say they can work something out. Now, when you're working something out, you are dealing with individuals. You're not dealing with things, right? With objects and means and ends relationships. You're dealing with people. And this is what Amy did very well. She was able to consider the relationships of the individuals involved in Heinz's dilemma, the story, and to try to come out with some alternative that will be beneficial to everyone. Jake, on the other hand, says, forget that, right? The goal is get those drugs into Heinz's wife as soon as possible and do it no matter what, even if it involves breaking the law. In this case, stealing the drugs. So what is happening with Kohlberg, right, is this cognitive approach. It might be interesting, but it's flawed because Kohlberg is not looking at the two different ways in which Jake and Amy achieve their understanding of Heinz's dilemma. So Kohlberg is observing how children think, but he also values the way in which they're thinking one way over another. In other words, they're not different but equal. Clearly, in this case for Kohlberg, one is better than the other. And the one that is good for him is the one that Jake proposes, which is goal-oriented, rather than working through the thought processes and dealing with the relationships of the people involved in this particular story. So what happens with Kohlberg is that he misunderstands how women think. That's essentially it, right? What are their motives for thinking this way rather than that? Why do they think this way rather than that? When I say that, thinking in this kind of goal-oriented, impersonal kind of way. How do we measure their moral commitments, their psychological growth, when the way in which that schema is designed doesn't account for that? So what's happening is you're trying to measure something that is there, but with tools that don't even recognize that this alternative, this different way of thinking is actually there. And that's essentially what happens with Kohlberg. And as it turns out, Carol Gilligan, this woman here, this psychologist, she sort of essentially thought the same way. So she ended up writing a book, this book right here, in a different voice. And she said, look, interesting, sure. But those two kids, Amy and Jake, are thinking differently. But just because they're different doesn't mean that one is better than the other. They're simply different. Amy's way of thinking is not inferior. It is just a different approach. It's a different voice, right? A different viewpoint on this dilemma. So Jake's response may be considered higher because we're dealing with an ethics of principle rather than an ethics of caring. So the ethics of principle, which is to save someone's life, for example, seems to overshadow this ethics of caring. And ethics of caring here is, of course, Heinz's wife, who's really at the center of all of this. Then there is Heinz, who's obviously worried to death about his wife and will do almost anything to save her. But then there's also the pharmacist, right? The pharmacist who, yes, it's a hell of a markup on his product, but he believes that he should be paid this because of whatever reason. But Amy considers all of these people. And Jake, in a sense, doesn't. He's more goal-oriented. And that's more sort of dealing with ethical principles than with principles of caring. So that male way of impersonal thinking kind of abstracts everything. It abstracts the context. It abstracts the individuals that are involved in the story and really kind of makes it this kind of linear cause and effect relationship, this kind of means ends way of looking at things, which is simply not the way in which women think, right? That very distinctive flavor that, okay, this is a woman who was dying, whose husband is absolutely mortified that he can't do anything. What is he going to do? Because the drugs exist, right? There is a cure, but he can't afford that cure. What can he do? You could start a GoFundMe page. I don't know, but you could do something. But what is happening here is that women, according to Carol Gilligan, find it very hard to ignore those contextual details, those details about personalities and interrelationships, because that is in a sense the way in which women have been brought up. And so being brought up in the private realm for maybe a little bit longer than boys, women, according to Gilligan, see these relationships at work and at play. And it is used for conflict resolution. And this becomes a very valid way of seeing the world. So it's not that Kohlberg, sort of his schema is completely dead wrong. What's wrong with it is it's just not measuring the right thing. You should come up with a different schema that says, okay, let's measure stages of development in ethics of caring, not just the stages of moral development as it deals with simply principles. It has to deal with context. It has to deal with individuals that are in those particular dilemmas to work out something that is going to be equitable for everybody. So for Gilligan, the sensitivity to the needs of others allow women to hear those different voices and to hear those different points of view. And as she writes in her book, women's moral weakness, right, something that was allegedly a weakness, manifests in the confusion of judgments, is thus inseparable from women's moral strength. So that confusion of judgment is a woman weighing all those different options. It's not confusion. It's very systematically looking at each one and weighing each one in terms of relationships, in terms of context. So this is what makes women's moral strength quite different than men, and an overriding concern with relationships and responsibilities. And I'm just going to read one short passage here from her book in the very last section, where she says, "Thus women not only reach midlife with a psychological history different from men's, and face at that time a different social reality, having different possibilities for love and for work, but they also make a different sense of experience based on their knowledge of human relationships. Since the reality of connection is experienced by women as giving rather than freely contracted," notice the word contract, right? That's something we do in the public. "They arrive at an understanding of life that reflects the limits of autonomy and control." In other words, there are limits as to how far we can extend that kind of means-end contractual sort of relationship, because we don't have an unlimited degree of autonomy. We know these people. They are our friends and family, and they live in our community. They're our neighbors. So that degree of autonomy and control it's less there than, it's less noticeable for men than it is for women. As a result, women's development delineates the path not only to a less violent life, but also to a maturity realized through interdependence and taking care. So this is essentially what Carol Gilligan is arguing, this notion that there are different approaches to understanding a situation. And the sooner we understand the context and the individuals involved in it, the better we can, or the quicker we can start to make an assessment that will be beneficial to the most number of people. So, psychologists, needless to say, have studied the interaction between sex, gender, emotion, and morality, and it turns out that men and women score essentially the same. There's really not that huge of a difference. Certainly here, throwing a punch if a family's insulted, 32 versus 20, or 22 versus 20. Having an affair, falling out of love with a spouse, 10%, 10%. So we think, men and women, we tend to think reasonably the same, but small differences, such as the ability to hone in on the context, the individuals involved in that dilemma, that ethical dilemma, that is what makes the female perspective slightly different. And again, the key word is different. Not inferior, not better even, but different. And sometimes those thought patterns are the best way to resolve a crisis. So the question becomes, why do women think differently if this is the issue that we're raising? And psychologists and, of course, sociologists have come up with a couple of reasons why women think differently than men when it comes to acknowledging and being aware of interrelationships and social relationships. And there's two of them. One is the social roles that women have occupied traditionally, have been traditionally in the private realm. There are relationships in terms of raising children, like not only giving birth, but birth and caregiving as well. And the social roles that women have traditionally occupied, and of course, over the last, say, 30 years, that has changed. But traditionally, the social roles were about relationships, were about raising family, were about sort of conflict resolution in the private realm. That's one. The second one is the way in which women would internalize the effects of socialization much earlier. We had the sort of that little 6-part pyramid, and I would argue that young women internalize socialization much more quickly. And little boys will vroom vroom the way out of the sandbox with their cars and their G.I. Joes and the footballs. And women seem to understand duties and social roles and social interaction sooner and differently, because of these two things. The fact that they're able to internalize social norms more quickly, because norms are simply prescriptive behavior. And as you well know, when a woman sort of misbehaves, we'll put that in big quotations, misbehaves, what does that mean? Well, she's not acting like a lady, right? Bear with me here. Like, let's say it's the 1950s. She's not acting like a lady. She's wearing pants. Oh, okay, whatever. But at one point, that was happening. Women shouldn't be riding bicycles in the 1930s because they'd be wearing dresses. Well, of course, wearing trousers was better, right? It was safer. But what that meant was women were stepping out of traditional social roles. So some women, of course, throughout history, may have internalized those social roles, but that did not mean that they, at a certain point, may have wanted to move out of them and to strike out into a different world. But psychologists and sociologists believe that women think the way they do because of the social roles that they have traditionally occupied and their ability to internalize socialization much more quickly. So it does indicate that women learn social interaction and the importance of it at a much earlier age. So, as I've mentioned all the way along here, we've got these two spheres, right? The public and the private. And men have, for sure, dominated the public sphere of contract signing and declaring war and running for government and things like that. And women have, again, traditionally been relegated to that private sphere of the family. So what happens as a result of that is social, political, and moral philosophies that have been written about these kinds of behaviors really have pretty well ignored the private life. Put it this way, my PhD dissertation was on Hegel, a German philosopher, 1770 to 1831 is when he lived. And I worked on one small section of one of his 15 or 18 books, and I was writing about the family. And it's a little sliver in a 350-page book where he talks about the family as the way in which the natural can be subsumed into the social. So he says natural inclinations, including sexuality, of course, are internalized within the family. And no sooner does he describe that, whoop, the family's gone. And we're talking about society and civil society and economic contracts and the state and laws and, well, what happened to the family? Yeah, well, we mentioned it. That's just one example. So moral philosophers and philosophers in general have really kind of ignored the private realm up until very recently. And this is the reason why so little was discussed and thought about in terms of women's roles, because the biggest blind spot in philosophy was ignorance of women and ignorance of the private realm. It just was simply not an area that men were not comfortable writing about, but just ignored, just didn't see it, right? It was a blind spot. Probably no better or worse than the blind spot many of the ancient Athenian, right, the ancient Greek writers like Plato and so on, that wrote about freedom and happiness while living in a slave state. Okay, really, how does that work? Well, oh, right, Plato was an aristocrat. Yeah, okay. And he hated the demos. He hated, the people because they were stupid and ignorant and they're just workers. So, etc., etc. So there has been a problem in philosophy up until very recently in ignoring the private life of individuals, and specifically the private life of women, because that's typically where we would find them. So for morality to work today, for us to correct this injustice, right, we must be able to accommodate loving and caring relationships into a larger sort of purview of morality. It is now a part of a larger viewpoint. So it isn't relegated to kind of like off to the side, kind of some subcategory. It's now an integral part of moral philosophy, the notion of loving and caring that exists in the private realm, traditionally with women. But this notion of being loving and loyal and dependent is now looked at as a weakness or some kind of confusion. It is looked at as something that is very, very important, and something about going beyond one's duty, right? Remember Immanuel Kant? Last week, I believe, when we were talking about the categorical imperative, a couple of weeks ago, the categorical imperative, right? Do it because you're doing your duty. Well, for Kant, and he had awful things to say about women, with Kant, it was about a duty, regardless of the context. regardless of who it was. So yeah, we need to go beyond doing one's duty and connect, right? Truly connect with the other. And if that other is a member of our own family, our friends, our neighbors, our community, then that's obviously a good thing, because that is the way in which we're able to grow as individuals. So in the end, right, ethics of care, such as has been described by Carol Gilligan in her book and many others, this notion of ethics of care is now part of a more modern ethics of virtue. And we'll look at ethics of virtue next week as well, when we talk about Aristotle. And so this is something that is not sort of exclusively a feminist project, because there are many, there are men who are feminists and there are women who are not feminists. So it's not exclusively tied to women writing about other women. Men can write about women. I wrote about the family. Here I am. So it's not an exclusively feminist project. It's one that has now moved into the mainstream of a modern version of ethics. And in particular, this notion of ethics of care, which is now just as valued as any other discussion about morality. So the key points here, the idea that men and women think differently has been used to justify the latter's discrimination by relegating them to the private realm or to having no status whatsoever. And the change between the sort of second or third wave of feminism was in the 60s and 70s. The notion was that women were the same. Women could think the same way as men. And now, in the going third into the fourth wave of feminist thought, the notion is that women think differently, but equally. So there's no inferiority or superiority idea. There's simply different ways to approach something. We talked about Kohlbergs, the Heinz's Dilemma, about having to steal the drugs for Heinz's wife to survive. And Kohlberg used this little dilemma, this little story, to measure the moral development of men and women, and found that women get stuck at this third spot here: cultivate relationships and perform duties and social roles. Now remember, as women have moved into the public realm, how, surprise, duties and social roles are awfully limited, and that's only now changing. I'd say in my lifetime, I've seen it change. But it's not to say that women cannot move to these higher levels. There are many, some of my favorite philosophers are women who clearly have gotten to the sixth stage. So this way of thinking is antiquated at best and hugely sexist at worst. And then finally, for Jake, Heinz's dilemma can be resolved, or in his mind, Jake's mind, it can be resolved through impersonal relationships. In other words, it's kind of a means-end relationship. Okay, the means for the end, which is Heinz's wife will survive. The means is steal the drugs. End of discussion. All right, next. Amy, on the other hand, looks at it in terms of personal relationships, namely between Heinz and the pharmacist, and also between Heinz and his wife. And each one of those individuals, it may only be three, but all three are considered carefully in order to come up with something that is equitable for everyone, that is fair for everyone. Now, Kohlberg, on the other hand, because he's looking at goal-oriented behavior, thinks that Amy is inferior when in fact her way of thinking is simply different. She is resolving that issue differently. She's not so worried about goals, but should be worried about the thought process into coming up with the best and most equitable conclusion. So clearly the two children think differently, but Amy's way of thinking is not inferior. It's merely different. It's about thought processes versus goal orientation, which is more like Jake. So male ways of thinking abstract away the details that give each situation this very distinct flavor. We could be talking about friends, family, neighbors, our community. That distinct flavor, the relationships we have with these people really will color in a good way, in a positive way. It will color our decisions, color our way of thinking about what is the most equitable solution to this. So that is part one of Module 10, 10A, and I'll be back very shortly to conclude with Module 10B.